Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your patience and welcome to the ESPA dialogue, a global dialogue. That's one of the reasons why we're a little bit late, because we're trying to join our global colleagues by VC. This is a session on ecosystem services for poverty alleviation. We've got a number of speakers today. I'm going to ask them all, please, to be as brief as they can, 5-minute presentations, and then a very short round of questions at the end. Forgive us for that, but we wanted to encourage our global colleagues to join this presentation today. So, on the panel here, we have Patricia Pinho from the Brazilian Space Agency, INPE. We have Professor Mark Huxon from Napier University, Edinburgh. We have Professor John Deering from the University of Southampton. Our 3 colleagues I've just mentioned will be speaking. We have Dr. Bhaskar Vera from Cambridge University, who is here for questions, as is my colleague on the end, Professor Georgina Mace from Imperial College. And we will hear from Paul van Gardingen, who is the director of the ESPA program, if he can turn his attention now from the screen. So I think we better kick off, everybody. We've got a short time left and we need to go. Paul, are you ready to introduce us?
Okay, thank you very much. The purpose of today is really twofold. One is to tell you a bit about ESPA and about why it's special, but also to send a message out to the community that as a world-leading international environment program, it's time to actually work differently. So instead of flying all of my researchers here, we've got them joining us from around the world by video. It's about being smart, delivering value, and using science to change the world. So firstly, let me just tell you a little bit about ESPA. ESPA is a unique research program. It joins 2 of the research councils, NERC and ESRC, with the UK's Department for International Development. And it's all about world-class science, which is going to change people's lives. People like this in a small pastoral community in a township outside Isiolo in Kenya. These people's lives are increasingly getting poorer because they no longer have access to the ecosystem services that they depend upon. This is now a major conflict area. People here are dying every day because of conflict over ecosystem services. Our research is about changing lives, about making people's lives better because of the way that the ecosystems enrich and empower them. Later on this morning, we're going to be joined from Bolivia by Nigel Asquith, and this is a project here which captures ESPA. It's about, on the side there's a little RCUK, Research Council UK notebook. The message there is research excellence with impact, and that is really about ESPA. And then to the right are 2 of the local community members, a father and his daughter, who are active participants in our research. And I hope Nigel will talk a little bit later on about why ESPA is different in terms of allowing us to do this excellent research which changes lives. Here's another one. Mark Huxham's here. He's got one of my favourite projects in Kenya called Swahili Seas. And here it is about working with local communities, using science, in this case, to help re-establish mangroves along the coast, enhancing livelihoods, protecting the coast. But what I quite like about this is an example of working in partnership with the private sector, because the UK insurance company, Aviva, is providing the funds for this as a prototype carbon offset project. But again, it's science improving lives. Really good science, already making a difference. We've also got a number of projects which are about feeding into debate. So later on, we've got Chetan here, who's going to be talking about his experience. And here, it's research informing this debate between different stakeholders about the future of their ecosystems. Generating evidence. Our projects are already generating some of the world-class research. Now, yesterday there was a question in this audience. What about having an index for ecosystem services, a little bit like the Dow Jones Index? Well, John Deering's here, and that's exactly what he's got. If you go onto one of our impact notes, These are some of them. You can read about it, but more importantly, very soon you'll be able to read a fantastic research paper describing the first index for ecosystem services. It's this type of research which makes ESPA special. When it comes down to it, it's about people like this. This young woman is a vet student at Makerere University in Uganda. She and her colleagues are involved in one of our new projects, which is looking at neglected infectious diseases. And our research has to make a difference for people like her, to allow her to do things differently, to use science to change lives. And as I said right at the beginning, our projects are not just innovative, the way that we do projects are innovative. There's two things about today's session. We're the only session at this conference which hasn't brought people in by plane. We're committed to changing the way that we work, so we work with Cisco and Janet to provide video conferencing to all our researchers for free, so they can have a step change in the way that they work. And today you'll see that in practice. We estimate on a monthly basis it saves us around about £10,000. In a really intensive month, it'll be much more. Turn that into other things you could do. The carbon that we save, but all of the things that we can do differently because we're innovative, but more importantly, we're doing it differently because we're working in partnership with the private sector. And that's my last point. ESPA is about partnership. It's cross-disciplinary, it's international, it joins researchers, civil society, and the private sector, and only that way will we make a real difference. And I hope this morning you can join in this dialogue as a starting point to see what a huge difference that can make. So I'll now pass on.
I would just like to take this moment too to introduce our colleagues who are on the VC. I believe you can see them at the top right of your screen up there. There we have them. Perhaps those of you on VC, you could raise a hand when I say your name, although it's possibly obvious, certainly for you, Dr. Janet Rangnathan from WRI. Welcome today. Nigel Asquith from Natura Bolivia, and Mr. Chetan Agarwal from Winrock International. Welcome, and we'll look forward to your reflections after our three speakers. We are hoping to have with us Professor Moses Chimbari. I guess we will wait and see if he joins us. He'll be in the top right corner. Patricia, thank you very much.
So good afternoon. Today I'm going to present, I'm part of an ESPA team who has been carrying out research in literature review for the Brazilian Amazonian ecosystem, try to evaluate to what extent ecosystem service could be a means to reduce poverty in the region. So for most of people know about it, but the Brazilian Amazon is one of the largest pristine areas in the world, the largest natural capital that we have, and at about 80% of the Amazonian rainforest lies in the Brazilian territory. Nonetheless, we have several threats that really endanger not only the ecosystem but also the livelihoods of local communities living in the area. So all these threats have led to severe increase in deforestation patterns in the Amazon, and these threats are pretty much linked to developmentist programs in the region, agriculture expansion, markets, influence, and different institutional arrangements that have been influencing, especially in temporal patterns of deforestation. We also face several challenges for ecosystem conservation and reduction of poverty in the Amazonia. So we have absence of state control, state encouragement of private ownership and unsustainable economic practice that is encouraged, and also problems of entitlement and lack of legal ownership. So in that sense, we try to investigate how ecosystem service and poverty alleviation are used and framed in the regional context of policymaking in the Brazilian Amazon. So then what we have done as a team, we analyzed several different policies in the region, concerned its direct and indirect impact on ecosystem service, at the same time trying to address poverty in the region. We also look at how these policies are really aligned with the international domain and international initiatives and programs. The methodology that we use, we had one expert workshop that was run in Brazil in 2010, and we also carried a really deeply literature review and expert elicitation on these issues. So then basically what we found out is like we have a timeline of the evolution of these social environmental development initiatives in the Amazon in relation to the international initiatives and policies, such as Stockholm Conference and IPCC first report, Kyoto Protocol, Rio 92, the biggest conference, and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and then UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity. All those initiatives have really had an impact in the way that the policies for addressing ecosystem service and also social development was happening at the regional domain. So as a result, we found out that there's a huge dichotomy between environment programs and social effectiveness, right? Not really acting to improving well-being. We also find a dichotomy between environment and the government development agenda, which is not only specific for Brazil, but I think it's mainly for most of the developing nations around the world. Nonetheless, Brazil has been responding to these international trends for mainstream ecosystem service and socio-economic development. However, this influence is always undermined or outweighed by Brazilian development interests. So then, as a conclusion, then I see Liz looking at me. We think that ecosystem service could be a means to reduce poverty in the region, but in order to do so, the local community should get secure rights and access to natural resource and be well integrated into the market reality, aiming towards sustainability. And we believe that this analysis can be an example also that can better contribute to conceptualization and implementation of the policy making agenda in Brazil. And again, so I think our study also set up examples how countries could be trying to mainstream and put in place issues of trying to integrate issues of protection and valuation of ecosystem service that is still perceived as antagonistic or in dissonance with the economic development and prosperity. So thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to rush us.
Okay, no.
While we're changing now to Professor Mark Huxham, could I welcome Professor Moses Chimbari from the University of Botswana, who's just joined us at the top of our screens.
Thank you. I'm here to introduce you to the Swahili Seas project and a particular part of that project called Mikoko Pamoja. Mikoko Pamoja is a community-based mangrove conservation and restoration project. It's based in Gazi Bay in southern Kenya, and to our knowledge it's the first project that uses carbon credits for mangrove conservation in Africa, one of the first in the world. So what I want to do today is just to introduce you to a few of the concepts that have allowed us to develop this project to the stage that it's reached so far. So you've already seen this slide. I like it too. It shows Judith and Salim planting mangroves, and it illustrates the first concept here, which is that we're building on about 10 years of research from the collaboration that we have there. So although this looks straightforward, planting mangroves, it turns out that it isn't. The site that you can see here is a degraded site on the beach, which was cut for illegal fuel wood for an industry that then went bankrupt about 40 years ago. And there's been no natural regeneration on that site at all subsequently. So one of the big questions is, why do sites like this, degraded sites, not restore themselves? And we needed to answer that piece of that research question before we could go ahead and start replanting these sites. And that's relevant not just to Kenyan sites, but there are sites across the world where mangroves have been destroyed and are not restoring themselves. The second research question that I want to highlight is about carbon. A lot of our focus here is on carbon as a mangrove, carbon sequestration as a mangrove ecosystem service. Of course, mangroves provide many, many ecosystem services, but there's a reason we're focusing on carbon, and that's because there's a market there. So it allows us to tap into that funding. So mangroves in Africa are suffering rates of degradation roughly similar to those in many other areas of the world, mostly driven by poverty level, small-scale use for firewood and fuel wood and for timber. In some cases, industrial-scale cutting. But we can look at that using remote sensing, and we needed to do that in order to find a baseline for our project. So in order to claim carbon credits, you need to be able to show that you're preventing deterioration. At present, one of the technical challenges for us is to demonstrate degradation as opposed to complete removal of mangroves. Most of the problem is degradation, but you can see from this slide that the purple area is the lost mangrove area since 1985. You can see fairly typically that we're losing large areas of mangroves, about 0.7% of Kenyan mangroves being lost every year. One of the big ways in which mangroves differ from other forest types is the importance of below-ground carbon. Mangroves make up roughly 0.7% of tropical forests. They're responsible for around 30% of all the carbon that's buried in tropical soils. So they have a massively disproportionate efficiency in terms of burying carbon. What we don't know, though, is what happens to that carbon once mangrove forests are degraded or cut down. That's something that we've been measuring in this project for quite some time. And you can see there a gas chamber, otherwise known as a bucket, which can collect CO2 emissions coming out of the mangrove sediment surface. And that allows us to see what happens when we start cutting mangroves down, when we degrade them. You can see on this slide that compared to a control, CO2 fluxes are enhanced when you remove mangrove trees. What that means is that below-ground store of carbon is susceptible, and it is vulnerable. It will be lost if we lose the forests. Using this information, this research information, it allows us to project carbon benefits for this project. These are extremely conservative benefits conservative projections, because we still don't know all that much about below-ground carbon in mangroves, but it does allow us to make a case for carbon trading on the voluntary carbon market, which brings me to a second principle, which is working in partnership in this project, working with the Kenyan government, the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute, with NGOs like Plan Vivo, which is a charity which registers carbon projects like ours, an Earthwatch Institute, which brings hundreds of volunteers to our project, and the private sector as well, particularly Aviva. Aviva have managed to give us some security in promising financial return to local people. And then our principle 3, because it is about community benefits, these resources, like most mangroves, are not privately owned. They're collective benefits. And what that means is we have to think about how the community as a whole can benefit, and we need a fair and equitable way of negotiating that. So here's one example of how we've managed to achieve that with a school building that's been produced as a result of funding for our project. So the next stage and the big challenge for us is how we scale up these small-scale initiatives to really make a difference along the whole East African coast.
So now we'll hear from Professor John Deering, and thank you, colleagues, for keeping your presentations tight.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to describe work that we're doing in China within this ESPA program, which, as it says, we're trying to develop a new evolutionary approach. And by this, we mean trying to reconstruct longer timescales for understanding and analysing ecosystem services. We're doing this because there's a number of knowledge gaps. In order to develop strategies that are sustainable, we need to have better data on regulating and supporting ecosystem services. we need to, in order to engage with the whole area of complex system dynamics, we need better time series to look at thresholds and interactions. And if we can put these two together, we might begin to move towards setting some boundaries or limits on human activities that are unsustainable. What I'm going to just describe very briefly are how we're combining social and environmental archives to do this from China to give multi-decadal time perspectives. So here we are in the lower Yangtze Basin in eastern China, this area here where Shanghai is on the coast and Nanjing a little bit further inland. And it's an area where, although there's great economic prosperity, there's a lot of rural poverty. There's also a lot of ecosystem service damage. There's flooding, there's water pollution, there's soil erosion and loss of biodiversity. There's changes at the coastline, particularly caused by the Three Gorges Dam. And there's a whole demographic issue, there are the social issues which are leading to an aging rural population. We want to know which parts of the landscape are resilient or sensitive. We want to know which agricultural systems or processes are at risk from passing a threshold. And we want to know what new practices could we adopt that would not increase the risk of ecological failure. And so what we've done is to reconstruct here in red, taking official statistical records, we've produced an aggregated index of provisioning services from 1950 to the present day. And what we've done to mirror that record of increasing service is to look at lake sediment records, which give us an insight into how the ecological regulating services are changing. And you can see they're kind of mirroring the rise in the provisioning services. There's essentially a trade-off here between the agricultural intensification that we've seen since 1950 and ecological degradation. There's some evidence, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, that the regulating services may be improving slightly since 2000, but as provisioning services decline, combination of land use change arrangements and increased regulation on water pollution in particular. Part of that system, though, which is hidden in the aggregated data, shows signs of critical unsustainability, and particularly the lake ecosystem, which we can see here, just pulled out of that data set, from 1900 to the present day, shows a clear tipping point in the early 1990s, when the system went from being moderately eutrophic to being hyper-eutrophic, very enriched with nutrients. And there's no obvious driving force of that. We're looking at the consequence of interacting variables, of possibly fertilizer usage, other aspects of land management. But there's no single cause and effect that we can identify. What we can do, however, is test some of the theories that are coming out of complex system dynamics about the possibility of finding early warning indicators, such as rising variance. And we can see in this example that, in fact, if we had been monitoring this system, we might have had 20 or 30 years' notice that the threshold was going to be passed. And that may allow us to look at other lakes which are yet to reach this critical transition. Lastly, putting this together, we've heard today and on other days about the planetary boundaries concept, where humanity has already exceeded boundaries for biodiversity, nitrogen and climate, the work of Rockstrom's group. Our aim now is to look at this in a regional context, based on dynamical properties. And so what we've done, just as almost a proof of concept here, is to look at particular ecosystem services like water purification, terrestrial biodiversity, and water availability for this one region. And we can see that water availability is still keeping within the safe zone, whereas water purification has gone well beyond this safe operating space, and terrestrial biodiversity too. So this could be a useful management tool for local agencies. And our next stage is to look at soil stability and food provisioning services. So in conclusion, paleoenvironmental records can extend the scope and length of ecosystem service records, particularly in less developed countries where there's a lack of monitoring data. In China, we show that these can help us observe complex behavior, converging trends, thresholds. It opens up the opportunity to find regional boundaries based on dynamical properties, and we're now going to apply this in other areas of the world, particularly Bangladesh and Malawi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. We're now going to hear from each of our discussants. And as I wasn't able to sort of nobble them behind the scenes beforehand, I need to ask you all if you could keep your contributions to 5 minutes so that we do have some questions at the end. Perhaps we could start with Dr. Janet Rangnathan from WRI in Washington.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I just want to sort of say how excited I am to be part of ESPA. You know, it's kind of very much what WRI, World Resources Institute, is about. It's about sort of bringing together the think tank, the academic research with the do tank. And I just want to sort of say that in terms of turning research into action or into change, one of the key things that we found at the World Resources Institute that's necessary for us to be able to do that is having a very sort of clear problem statement about just what is in those cases, in each of those examples in Brazil, Saheli strict seas, what is it that's causing ecosystems to be degraded or change in a way that affects the poor? And if you're really able to sort of drill down and find out what that problem is, and then trying to understand, well, how can your research help overcome that problem? And the sort of the 5 key problems that we typically see as the underlying reasons are the misalignment of economic incentives with keeping ecosystems. And I think that the carbon offsets in the mangroves is actually trying to address that. The lack of rights, that people who live in those communities have no rights over those resources, so can't do anything about it when others come in and convert that land. That is often the case in mangroves. It's also the case in forests too. Lack of accountability, and just a disconnect that people view ecosystems as something that gets in the way of development. Ecosystems can be liquid development. So inasmuch that you can actually tackle with your research some of those challenges, we're much more likely to be successful. But a lot of the times, our strategies actually address the wrong problem because we haven't drilled down enough to actually figure out what it is ultimately that's causing that. So I would sort of encourage each of the researchers to have that sort of really clear problem statement. In the case of the mangroves, I know that in other parts of the world, it has been a conversion factor. It's been an issue around rights. If it's an issue around rights, then changing the economic incentives by bringing in revenues around some of those services may still not do the trick, certainly from keeping mangroves as forests. I wanted to also make a suggestion about an example. There's the sort of irony in Brazil is that the degradation of forests, in particular for agro-industry, the irony there is that agro-industry very much depends in the region on the ecosystem services provided by the Amazon, in particular to regulating service, the hydrological services that the Amazon provides. So I think it is much as sort of making that case that it's not preserving the Amazon for nature's sake, it's actually preserving the Amazon to support the economic development goal of expansion of agro-businesses. Could be a very compelling one. Thinking about some key actors that you could get on your side to help make that case. So who will lose if the Amazon actually does reach a tipping point and switches over to savanna, and we lose that water regulating service? Who's going to lose? I mean, the organizations like the soybean industry. So convincing the soybean industry that the Amazon is in fact much more valuable to them alive than dead could create a really kind of critical ally in helping make the case for better enforcement, for actions that sort of maintain and actually enhance that ecosystem.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could hear from Professor Moses Chimbari.
I'm very pleased to be part of this panel, and I would like to make my contribution, particularly with regards the three presentations that have been made, which actually constitute a classical example of what ESPA should be doing. It is quite clear from the cases that have been presented that the aspirations of ESPA to put people in the center and improve the well-being of people with the hope that once people are enjoying good health, they are not actually going to cause harm to the environment. I would like to say that in most cases, particularly in the region that I come from in Southern Africa, for a long time, there's been a wrong myth that poor communities have a tendency actually to destroy the ecosystem. But evidence is now showing that it's not quite like that. It's just that people have been disenfranchised from the benefits that they used to get by the so-called protected areas, and therefore, in a bid to try to survive, they then tend to overharvest ecosystem services and thereby end up destroying the environment. Now, what we learn from the cases that have been presented is that the idea of bringing in new tools, and it's quite impressive, the presentation is actually appealing to places like Southern Africa where monitoring data is lacking, and yet there could be tools that can actually help us understand what has been happening and what can be improved. Also, the Swahili Seas does demonstrate the fact that actually people can benefit from, from their efforts to conserve the environment through the carbon market. And I think I've read a bit about this project and know that it's one of the great successes of the ESPA projects. The Brazilian experience also shows us how social development can be linked with ecosystem protection. So by and large, what I would like to really emphasize is the fact that all these three projects do clearly indicate the concept of engagement with not only the beneficiaries but the users of the results themselves. It is clear that the projects are working with the transdisciplinary teams, multidisciplinary teams, which can address both environmental, social, economic, and political aspects. And the centrality of people as beneficiaries is quite evident from these projects. I would like to end up by saying that perhaps more focus should actually be put in engaging the communities that are intended to benefit from the ecosystem services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chetan Agarwal, can we hear from you now? Please speak when you're ready.
Yes, thank you. So I really enjoyed the three presentations, and I think I like to flag a few points here. One, that we have a general sense of the science of provisioning services, that if you plant trees, then they'll grow up and you get so much wood. We know that, but to some extent, but the science of ecosystem services is much less understood, and that came through in several of the presentations. So the mangrove story, where if you harvest an area, it doesn't grow back. So maybe the provisioning services are not well understood why it didn't grow back, and they're trying to figure that out. And also they figured out the extent of carbon which was sequestered below the soil, so we understand that mangroves are really, really important disproportionately to their size. In the Brazilian presentation, it was more of a commons problem as well, I guess, and maybe the balance between regulations and incentives, which the presenter was talking about. That regulation is not enough, but you need to have some incentives at the same time. The flip side perhaps is that incentives without regulation or zoning may leave you to the vagaries of the market and market changes. So if land values change suddenly, then without the zoning in place, your incentives may go against the provisioning of environmental services, which is something we have seen in our ESPA site in the Western Himalayas as well. And the presentation from China was again very interesting for their almost forensic kind of approach of combining these huge data sets, both socio-economic as well as environmental. And I was actually wondering whether the lake sediment data, that's ex post, but how the trade-off between regulating and provisioning services, so that often doesn't come in very clearly to policymakers, that trade-off is at a local scale. So we understand the global scale trade-off that of carbon rises in the atmosphere, but locally how the trade-offs are being made, and if you're improving agricultural production, it goes up, but it's coming down, and how that's impacting your lake water quality maybe. I thought that was very interesting.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And lastly, we'll hear from Nigel Asquith, and then we will take some questions from the floor. So I hope the mics can be ready as we have a few minutes left. Nigel, up to you to speak now, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to very briefly tell you all about our ESPA project, because I think there's a lot in common with what we're doing with the Swahili Seas project. And I think of our project, we can, the lessons that I'll draw from our project basically replicate from what I see from the Swahili Seas project. So I'm trying to draw some, Paul asked me to talk about what's different about ESPA, so hopefully I'll conclude with that. So basically, in a nutshell, our ESPA project is working in eastern Bolivia in 130 very small communities, ranging between 5 and 15 families in each community. We've basically done socioeconomic, biodiversity, biophysical baseline, collected data, an X-ray of all 130 communities. And then we've worked with the municipal authorities to randomly split those 130 communities into 2 groups. And it was a random process. So now we have 65 communities where we've undertaken what we would call payments for environmental services. So in 65 randomly chosen communities out of the 130, we've undertaken, we've started offering services for people offering payments for people to protect their forests. So as of today, we have 950 acres under conservation contract, 122 families receiving compensation packages to the equivalent of about £10,000. So immediately we've given folks £10,000 worth of goods. It's never in cash, it's always goods. Bee boxes to produce honey, barbed wire to help protect their cattle, fruit tree seedlings, this type of thing. So basically we've undertaken this intervention of payments for environmental services. What we will do is say, okay, of the 65 communities where we've undertaken these interventions, that we've made the payments for environmental service provision, how does that affect socioeconomic status, biophysical situation of water quality, and the biodiversity situation of the forests that those people are protecting? So the idea is to see does the payments for environmental service intervention actually work or not, is our ESPA goal. Now, as we come back a bit from the actual ESPA project, if we look at what Natura Bolivian institutions over the last few years, specifically the numbers I'll give you of 2011, we as an institution have given small farmers about £100,000 worth of goods in payments for environmental service provision in 2011. And the crucial thing about this is, of that £100,000, £70,000 worth of these goods came from local sources such as municipal governments, people using water, the water cooperatives, the water providers, the communities. So we're getting huge leverage in terms of the international donor money, leveraging, at a 3-to-1 basis almost. Local funds are three per every one international fund for doing these payments. So there's huge leverage if we get the socioeconomic and the local socio-cultural way of doing things right. So with that introduction to the project, I want to pull out some lessons which I think, as I say, listening to the Swahili Seas project, seem very, very similar progress and implementation. I think the first message is what we've been able to do with ESPA funds is basically piggyback new research and a relatively small amount of new research money onto existing interventions. So we've got funding from European Union, MacArthur Foundation, 7 municipalities to undertake these payment systems. ESPA has just allowed us to turn that into an experiment. So we got huge leverage of ESPA funds to actually turn a conservation intervention into a science project. Second issue, again, which I think we share with the Swahili Seas project, is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit around the world in terms of improving livelihoods and doing good science and improving provision of ecosystem services. So a very small amount of a relatively low-tech research can actually have a huge, profound impact on communities, on environmental services, and pushing science forward. So I think what we've learned is we can focus the research funds on some very low-hanging fruit and get very, very interesting results very quickly and very cheaply. Third thing I think ESPA's allowed us to do, we've come up with some very weird and wonderful partnerships. Our partners as the project have gone on have changed slightly, but our academic partners are were the Harvard Business School and the University of Medellin now. We're working with 7 municipalities, 130 small communities, as I mentioned, European Commission, and Swiss Re is our private sector partner. So we're getting these weird and wonderful collaborations in the research. And then the final point, which we've learned, and again, I think Swahili Seas shows us, there are alternatives to national level payments from environmental services schemes, which are being promoted around the world. We're doing small scale, really working with communities on land tenure, giving people what they want, not calling it payments from environmental services, because in many communities those payments and environmental services are anathema. So we don't call it, we call it incentive-based conservation, compensation, that type of thing. So those are the big lessons. And again, thank you for letting me contribute to this presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to our discussants and our speakers. We've got about 10 minutes of questions, so I'd like to take 2 or 3 now and then ask the panelists for a very brief response, and we can do another round if we have them. If you'd like to ask a question, we've got roving mics. Please either address your question directly to a particular speaker or discussant, if you'd care to. Otherwise, I'll ask any of the panelists to choose who will reply.
My question is on the mangrove poverty project. I know that mangrove has a lot of ecosystem services, and because of that, in the developing world, the deforestation of mangrove can be linked to poverty. When I looked at that project, or when the Prof was delivering his presentation, I discovered not much is said about the method of how the map showed the degradation of mangrove was arrived at. And for me, that is very important, because I'm thinking of a situation where you can apply the technique in that project elsewhere in order to be able to address the problem of moving loss of mangrove in any area. When one considers the need to make sure that carbon is sequestered the way it should be sequestered, because from studies too, mangrove does it better than any other forest cover. So my question is, what imageries did you use? What I know again is that it's difficult to separate mangrove from other forest cover. What imageries do you recommend for use in doing that? Because that should be the starting point. Once you know how much of it has been removed in an area, the replanting like you did in an area that did not cover mangrove at all is different. But I feel if it is done, if we discover where mangrove existed naturally and we replant there and so on, it will further alleviate poverty, it will further help in climate change and so on and so forth. There are so many areas in the developing world that mangrove is lost almost on a yearly basis and there is no replacement. And we would like to apply the same technique in such areas in order for replanting. So the focus is on the images to be able to map this correctly in order for one to talk about the area and so on.
People could say who they are and what organisation they're with.
Okay, I am introducing myself.
Yes, please.
Okay, I am Robert Ikpeyong, senior lecturer in the Department of Geography, University of Nigeria.
Thank you very much. We have another question from the floor. Thank you. Over here.
Kamal Baba, University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Ashoka Trust in Bangalore. I have partly a comment and partly a question. I think these type of programs, first of all, just congratulations on developing this very fantastic program, much needed. But on the other hand, these sort of programs have existed under different names for the last 15, 20 years. USAID launched a program, Enterprises and Conservation in 90s in 20 countries. India has had a joint forest management program for almost 2 decades involving millions of people. And these people had success, these programs had successes and they had failures. And I think, and I'm sure, the people who have developed the program have learned from the failures of these programs and how to do things right. And it seems to, and the question is, it's not clear how one is going to measure the success of this program. When I think of ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, I think in terms of before the interventions, you have some counterfactuals about the economic status of the people who are involved. And after the interventions, you go and then you measure whether there have been really improvement in the well-being of the people. And I think I heard partly in one project, but it was not very explicit if that is the case with other projects too. I do realize that there are some projects which relate to policy, and in that case, you will measure to what extent you have changed the policies, not merely analyze the policies. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karina Benesai. I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University. And my question relates to, could you talk more specifically about what benefits are your different projects actually bringing to the poor? And not only potential benefits, but actual benefits. And in the Mangrove project, for instance, you talked a lot about the potential to obtain revenue from blue carbon. Is this revenue invested towards the restoration of the mangrove, or are you managing it differently? In which case, how? And I'd like to have some of your opinion from the panel about regarding direct payments versus other forms of compensations.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question and then ask the panelists to respond.
My name is Agatha Sector. I work for USAID in Tanzania. And I've worked on payments for ecosystem services in the past and again now in my current work. And often the problem is that the revenues that are generated, if there can be some, are very low and not enough to incentivize people. And so I was just wondering, throughout the different projects, what kind of revenues are you generating? And are they really enough to incentivize people to change their behavior? And especially when the revenues are going to local communities, which are not always the ones that are actually the primary cause of the degradation. How, what's that relationship like as well?
Thank you. So, panel, perhaps we could start with the mangroves response, but otherwise I will leave you, I think, to choose who would like to respond to the various questions we've had there. Perhaps, Mark, would you like to kick off on the mangroves? Is that...
Thank you very much for those questions. And my first response might address partly Robert and Karen, I think. Our project with forestry projects like these, there are really two forms of credits that you can claim for. You can claim for planting, and you can claim for avoided deforestation. And we're trying to do both of those things. The problem with claiming for planting is that the sorts of sites that I showed you are extremely degraded. They suffer from salinization, and they also suffer from severe wave erosion. And that's why they haven't been naturally restoring themselves. What that means is that we can replant there, but growth is going to be small. So there's lots of good ecological reasons to plant those sites, but you're not going to get large carbon benefits from doing that. So most of the carbon benefits in our project come from avoided deforestation, and that brings me to the issue of imagery. Most of the forest loss in Kenya is a result of degradation, so it's small scale below the canopy cutting, and that's really hard to pick up with remote sensing. You can do it, I think, kind of, but using very expensive imagery. And we didn't have the funds to do that, but we also really wanted to use an approach that was transferable to other projects, which had no funding at all. So we used Landsat imagery, which is freely available. And it turns out that is, with a bit of work, you can use Landsat to detect quite small-scale degradation in mangroves. But what you detect is aerial loss. So that's a small fraction, actually, of the total loss. But it does allow us to, or it has allowed us to set a baseline that we can claim against in terms of avoided deforestation.
Thank you. I've got Georgina, and then I think Paul.
Just a quick comment, speaking as a member of the Directorate for ESPA, addressing the 2 points about the scope of the programme, really. So perhaps one thing we should emphasise is we're in the early stages of this programme. So there's a lot more science underway now, and that we will be launching later this year. But I think the difference from previous kind of environment poverty-based projects is that we do have an integrated set of fundamental research programs that look at all dimensions of the environment, the biophysical, the ecological processes going on there, and many dimensions of people's well-being and poverty. And so the idea is that no longer will we rely on just observations of correlations between environmental degradation and improvements in people's well-being, but we'll have a much more holistic understanding of the processes and interactions that drive those correlations, and therefore we'll be able to provide information to decision and policy makers that will help them design interventions that are sustainable. So I think it's a really important thing that in the past we've seen many patterns where the environment degrades and people's well-being degrades, or the other way around, but we don't really understand exactly why. And the added value of ESPA will be to provide a body of knowledge that lets us predict that and provide decision makers with the information to improve well-being in more than just monetary terms.
Thank you. Paul.
Okay. Just want to follow on for what Georgina said. And one of the things which, there was a question about how are we learning from the past. I think the most important thing about where ESPA differs from most things which have come before is our starting point, and the thing which we build upon all our impact upon is the very high quality and relevant science that we're funded. One of the lessons that we've found from looking at previous interventions is, where's the evidence? Well, ESPA is all about generating that world-class evidence, which is going to give people a much better basis to make decisions in the future. And that is why we've got this amazing partnership joining Natural Environment Research Council, Economic and Social Research Council, and DFID. That is what makes ESPA special, and that's what's going to deliver impact. The second thing linked to that is Georgina's role as the director of the knowledge team is to give the strategic vision for what we're doing. And one of the important things that our directorate does is to give the vision for the world-class research we're going to do and the impact. And go to our website, it's www.espa.ac.uk/knowledge for the vision on the research /impact to see how we're going to turn that into results that change the world. Liz, do you want me to answer the two questions that have come online very quickly?
Yes, very quickly.
Okay, we've had two online questions. What about poverty? And particularly is this just about money? Absolutely not. ESPA takes the whole dimension of poverty, whether it be income, well-being, health, happiness, opportunities. And again, there's a lot of material on our website which is doing that. We have another question, we're not sure where it's from Stephanie Hodge, asking what's the link to education? And I think my abiding memory from the last year was actually going into the field with Nigel and his team in Bolivia and going to a few schoolhouses there and seeing the young people there being engaged in this, and they were actually doing the educating. They were educating the researchers, they were educating their parents. It's an absolutely crucial part of it. And Liz's role as our advisor on communication is all about this, about engaging in new ways, whether it's linking to schools, theatre, a whole series of things about making a real impact.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to close. We started a bit late, and thank you for your patience. So what we've got in the poster section is a series of posters that are also related to the issues we've been covering today, and we really welcome you all to go and have a look at those. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed for your interest. It's been good fun to do this. Thank you very much to our colleagues who are in their offices overseas.
And some thanks, actually. Just to finish off, if I can actually pass on some immense thanks. It won't look like this, but this only came together about 2 minutes before we started. And I have to really say thank you for Cisco for providing the technology. It really changes lives to be able to do this. And very much to Elsevier and the team at the Excel Centre who brought this together. I want you to go away with one thought. If we're serious about changing the world, why don't we change the way that we work as well? It works here. Forget what you've heard in the past, that video conferencing doesn't work. It works. Let's do more of it. Let this be the last conference where this is a novelty. The next one, let this be the norm.
Thank you, Paul. Here endeth the lesson, I think.